class is very fluid. I think we've all felt rich in moments and all felt poor in others. Even though like broadly society has like these metrics and, oh, okay, this costs that much. You put yourself in a different room and automatically it's like, well, I have quote unquote more than the people around me. And then you go into another room and it's like, wow, they are loaded, right? And I think since I've felt that before in my life, both sides of the coin, I've been able to translate that into my fiction.
Hello. We are back. This is the Young Eager Writers podcast. I am Desirée Brown.
And I am Michael Evans.
Today, I feel like this is a fun episode. We want to talk to you guys about writing about different socioeconomic backgrounds. I have some personal thoughts on this that I want to share. But I'm going to get full disclosure because I want to be honest with you guys. My brain is foggy today. So I might be just out of it. I just think that I didn't get enough sleep or something. Something is wrong with me today. But hopefully we have some really cool points for y'all. But I do want to give a disclaimer. One of the things that Michael and I have talked about is we feel it's really important as young writers to discuss different topics of inclusivity, of, who are we allowed to write about, what perspectives are important to include in our writing, in our reading. So I want you guys to know that different topics are definitely coming, but I do also want us to have specific guests with specific experiences that might be outside of my and Michael's experiences to kind of educate us and educate our audience. So that's why we chose the topic that we're going to talk about today. I have some personal experience with this that I want to share. But yeah, so just putting that out there.
Yeah, no, it's funny about like the socioeconomic background when thinking about writing because it doesn't always like obviously apply. What I mean by that is like if you are writing a sort of like fantasy world, it might not be obvious in your world building. It might not be part of the script to have different socioeconomic classes. However, from my experience, most books have people who have different privileges in society. And a lot of times, even if those privileges don't directly equate to like money, because it's not set in our contemporary world, it's something related to like they have more power. And money is something that is one way that can buy you more power in our society. There's other ways too. And I think today it'll be really good to focus on how we've kind of experienced it ourselves in our writing, but also the tropes and stereotypes that exist and why it might not be a good idea to include some of your writing, because it's not always entertaining to readers and it's not always like really inclusive of people from different backgrounds. And also there's a better way to write. You can write a better story by being more aware of people from different experiences. So that's what we're going to hope to bring to y'all today and hopefully give you some tools to be able to go out and kind of develop your own perspective on these things, because we're not trying to tell you like, that's a stereotype. Don't use that. But instead write about rich people this way. We're not going to try and tell you how to write about certain people, but we're definitely going to tell you maybe places to look so that you can develop your own perspective.
Yeah. I think that it's really important to think about the tropes that exist and really ask yourself how accurate and fleshed out it is. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, my own personal experiences. My upbringing was very strange. At least I think it was strange. There was this duality happening where my parents were separated or divorced. And so when I was with my mom, which is the majority of the time, we didn't have a lot of money. We were struggling to pay for specific things. I didn't have name brand clothes. I didn't have name brand food. We would get clothes donations from people that my mother worked with. So that was a lot of like my winter clothes, my winter coats, my dresses, like a lot of those things that were difficult to afford. On the flip side, my father owned his own business and he made a lot of money, and he was, it was really, I don't want to say it was at the peak. I mean, it's still at the peak, but I just mean that it had really grown at that point and become very stable. So when I was with him, which was not the majority of the time, we would go eat dinner at a steakhouse. New clothes if I wanted, if I asked. He had helped me pay for 2 different cars. So these are things, that privileges that I very much understand that not everybody has. So I was living that, rich kid lifestyle, but not all the time, which became very complicated for me and my own identity. I still struggle with it. So I think the reason I bring that up is because one of the things that this experience has given me is something to write about, which is, all experiences. But that conflict that I had was very important in either my characters or my poetry. It is something that I know other people are experiencing. And I think that gives my characters, the way that I write about, socioeconomic differences, either in my romances and my YA novels, they are a little bit more fleshed out than the tropes that we see in these more like teenage movies and stuff, where you have that stereotypical mean blonde girl who is just a brat and she's terrible and miserable. Those have become cliche, and I think that it's important to kind of step away from that. I'm not saying that your rich characters in your books don't have to be mean or bullies or anything, but I think that it's a little bit more complicated than that a lot of the times, and I think that's the case for a lot of us.
Yeah, I think it goes many different ways in sort of like the interface between popular media and our own lives. For me, it's been I guess unique in a different way from Desiree, but I think all of our experiences are unique. And for me, my parents were also divorced, but my dad I never really lived with him at all. So it was much more, I was always with my mom, and she worked hard, and we were able to like live, I would say, like a typical middle-class lifestyle in America. However, it wasn't like an easy one. I saw her working like 60, 70-hour weeks a lot of times. And I knew she was doing everything she could to like make things work for us, because there was limited support from my dad. And when I went to college, I feel like I'm now surrounded by like very drastic extremes, because in college I'm around people who are, I guess, like from lower socioeconomic background than I come from, and just lower in terms of income. It's not because it's worse, but definitely in many ways I would say had it harder growing up. And that is, not very common, but a few people. Then there's a huge chunk of people who have a lot more money than I ever grew up with, and a lot more access to so many different things. And there's just like kind of the life that you live when both your parents do certain jobs is different than when your parents do other jobs. The dreams that you even have for yourself are a bit different. And that for me has been something to write about, because I think for me, I've found a very big discomfort in that so many of the people that are very well off, not that they don't deserve it, but that people do just get lucky sometimes. And I think I myself have always had a heart for the underdog. But it's funny because although a lot of, I think, movies, books like to definitely hold up the underdog and try and say that the kid who got bullied, the kid who was knocked down, can make it. And in many ways, I like to try and have my books have that in it, not necessarily like playing to tropes, but um, the idea that no matter where you come from, you can make your dreams come true. It might be hard. You might be able to have to overcome really difficult obstacles that other people don't have to, but that you can. And that's the hope that I want to give people. But then I think about other things and I'm like, well, this is maybe just the stories I like to read, because billionaire romances, for instance, are huge, and they're literally about, like, you know, being with billionaires, and typically these are heterosexual romances where the female is not the billionaire in question here, it's the man. And you can imagine, kind of how those go, and those are very popular. Like, people like them. It's not like people are cringing at these tropes. Another, like, really common trope is in romance as well, the very rich girl, the girl who comes from the rich family. This is particularly popular in YA. Kind of falls for the guy on the wrong side of tracks of sorts. And one kind of story that we actually have a connection to here at Younger Writers is Outer Banks, and we interviewed the writer, and they very much use that trope where the rich Sarah Cameron was with John B., who was fatherless and motherless and kind of like an attractive mess. So it's interesting to me because I feel like when it comes to wealth in stories, it's not always, like, at least for me when I think about the tropes, it's not always clear to me if it leans heavy one way or another, and like what's bad or good about it. So I'm curious for what you think, Desiree. Like, when you think about these tropes, to you, what are the ones that stick out, and maybe what concerns you about some of them?
Yeah, that's a good question because I think for me, I'm so glad you brought up the word underdog because I thought that's such a great word that kind of encapsulate words. Um, uh, what am I trying to say? Encap in capsules
Encapsulate.
encapsulate. Oh my god, this is what I mean about the foggy brain. Captures is what I'm gonna say. Um, I think that the word underdog, like it's that's exactly what you think is that that maybe it's a shy kid, usually male. He's bullied, maybe he's not very well off, just kind of like us, like having a working mom and not giving everything. He's the unlucky one, and then he all of a sudden gets the rich girl, he becomes maybe popular, maybe he stands to his bully. Like, there's so many things about these stories that we really like, but it's also like there are certain parts of that trope that I feel like need to evolve. Kind of like you said with like that rich girl is this prize. Like, she's this thing to win. Or just like you said, this millionaire, hardworking male figure that, this main female character swoons over. I think that when the socioeconomic aspects of these characters make these characters just caricatures, I think that's where it becomes a dilemma because, just like I was talking about my own experiences, it's like, yes, I was on the poor side. Yes, I was on more of the wealthier side. But there's so much to both of those experiences that a lot of these tropes miss out on. One trope I as of now, I feel like is a healthy trope is actually the rich kid that has this pressure or this neglect from parents. I feel like from what I have seen and the people that I know in my life, and even the kids that I've taught, because I've taught kids of all ages, that is a very accurate trope where I really feel for those neglected kids. So I think there are healthy tropes that really shine a light on these different kinds of experiences. And then there's some that aren't. Like, for instance, I think one of the tropes that I'm not a fan of on the flip side is like this poor female character who doesn't take care of herself. I get that, makeup is expensive. Yes, absolutely. Like fancy shampoos is expensive. 100%. I have been there. Um, but I also did not ever understood, like, I never understood why these poor characters were just like shaggy hair and then all of a sudden, like, they only looked attractive when they had that expensive makeover. And it was like, come on, like, really? Like, maybe they looked attractive beside that, like, maybe. So those are some of the unhealthy tropes that I'm not a fan of. But yeah, I don't know, what do you think about some of these? Am I like off the mark?
Rating Desiree's trope opinions, starting now. I think that I definitely agree with you in the last one. I would rate that as a 5. That's a good hot take, because I think that not a lot of times how we think about beauty in society gets wrapped up into all these superficial things, that it's about, is she wearing nice clothes, do they have nice things, right? Like it gets wrapped into things that, that ugly guy in a Lamborghini, or that ugly person in a big home might seem more attractive. And that's something, though, that although I don't like it as a trope, feels very real to me, because that is something that I do see in the world a lot, that, a lot of guys will value women very superficially. And that likewise, I think that, many men can feel this pressure that they're valued in a way that also is quite superficial. And I think subverting that trope, yet being aware of it, can be really interesting. Not to say that people aren't that way, but that people can also be something else. And that also, at the end of the day, like, that isn't really what it's about. It's almost this social pressure that we all perform together collectively, but it's not one that makes any of us, I think, better people. And I think even more connected to the person. I think when you were talking about the trope of the rich kids and being neglected, I'm going to agree and disagree with you. And I think I'm not going to ever disagree flat out, because I think that, like, everyone's experiences are valid, and that probably does represent an experience that some people connect with. But what I would, I guess, maybe throw as another trope that I see that is, like, also dangerous to me, that can play on the opposite side of things, is that a lot of times rich people and their families are shown as having two very hardworking yet disconnected parents. And then the flip side is poor families are shown as having two parents who, like, don't have their shit together. Frankly, they might be alcoholics, abusive, and I don't like how a lot of times these things can be tied to class, because I think that there's a lot of people who come from a lower socioeconomic background who are just, like, really working hard at a job that doesn't pay them as much per hour. And there's a lot of people who come from very wealthy families who, they don't work that hard. They have their addictions and at very similar rates to people who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And I feel like we almost, like, in our stories and how we portray people who don't have a lot of money, is it's almost like we have to give them an excuse for not having it. And I think sometimes like the weird part of life that isn't very fun and doesn't maybe make for a good story is that like you just end up in a certain place, and it's not because you had a crazy hardship or you got crazy lucky. You just ended up in a place in which, okay, yeah, I have to work 60 hours a week to support my family and I can't be there for them. And we're also, in a 2-bedroom apartment, and that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I wholeheartedly agree with that because, especially when you think about the values, I think that's something that's really important talking about, more the writing craft and writing about different socioeconomic statuses. I think values is a huge one. Um, the values that I had in the home, or that the house with my mother did not match the values in the house with my father. The values in my lower class household, it was about family. It was about making time and helping people. It was about being kind. It was about being respectful and polite, but it was about being kind to people, because those were the things that we valued. I'm not saying that this wasn't valued in the other household. That was just, it was, it was valued higher. Where
Yeah.
in my other household, the values were, did you get dressed today and do you look nice? Are you speaking to people with a specific tone? Are, you saying the correct words and language, and like when you address someone? And I'm not saying I was never disrespectful. I was always very respectful. Um, but there were little instances like that where you had to know exactly how to, you were a representation of, your parents and that their wealth. And so you had to present yourself a certain way. Um, but the value was not always, let's sit down and have a dinner together. So I think that is something that, but then again, also it is very different. Like, I don't think that families, lower class families, have to be ones that have these immense problems. Like, someone has a drinking problem here. If that's a part of the story, then wonderful, but it doesn't have to be a direct result of, this is why this family does not have money. Just like you said, there's many other circumstances. I didn't have money, in my mother's household because of the divorce. Like, that's just, it wasn't anything crazy. It was just simply that. Um, so I think that's something to think about, when you're writing your own stories, is sometimes the problem is just not having money. It doesn't have to be all these added things of, well, they also are poor, and then they also have a father with drinking problem, and they also have a mother, who, whatever, is totally mean, or just dazed, like whatever it is. So yeah, I think that I do totally agree with you on that.
Then I have a question about when thinking about the American dream,
Mm,
because I think people from other countries might be listening, and it depends on what your cultural context is. But I think America certainly has a specific obsession with economic class, and certainly like this isn't exclusive to American culture, but it's something that we do tend to do. And I'm curious what you think, because the American dream is like this ethos meta trope that exists in a lot of movies, fiction. And how do you feel about how it's portrayed, and maybe sometimes how that really is in the real world?
this is what I feel like I'd have to ponder on, actually. Um, there's a lot of feeling I have with the concept of the American dream. Um, I think the American dream, the way that specific people describe it, is limited not only to class, but it's limited to race and ethnicity. Like, it's it's almost like an elite club that only this amount of people are able to achieve. Now, that's not the American dream that I believe in, that I want to be true. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that that's something to think about. I mean, like you said, that people in other countries, other countries definitely have their, I mean, everybody wants, someone in a Ferrari next to them. Like we all kind of want that. It's a part of it. But the interesting thing about the American dream, specifically in regard to class, is the pull yourself up by your own bootstraps mentality that I think is problematic, to say the least, because it's not simply that. It's not simply if you work hard enough, you can achieve, you can gain all this money and achieve your dreams and live this wonderful, fantastic life. It's not that simple. It isn't. And that's, I think, something that's important when thinking about writing these tropes is, are you really looking at that? Like, are you maybe it would be important to make a comment on the fact that, like you said, Michael, you said some people are just lucky. I think it's more complicated than that. Some people were born a specific way, and then they are that elite class that gets that American dream that everybody's talking about. I think that would be important when thinking about these tropes of, if you're going to include certain aspects in your writing, um, you know, start to question that. It's like, what does this family look like? How did they get the wealth they had? Why is this rich kid in your story the way that he is? What privileges does he have? How did he why does he have these specific privileges? So, that might be a messy way to answer your question, but yeah, I think that in regard to thinking about the way that the American dream is represented, not only in literature as a whole, but just in our own individual work, um, I like to think about, how can I you take this apart and like reframe it so it's accurate to really what the American dream is. Did that make sense? That was really kind of crazy.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really noble and great thing to do, because I agree with you. There's a huge problem in our society that, certain people have the ability to dream of certain things. Your dreams are connected to your real life experiences, and although when you go to bed at night, you can dream about things that are a little bit far distant. You usually have nightmares when you're having a tough time. And I think that, you can't divorce what people's lives could be from what it is. And a lot of times we like to think about the home runs that can happen in life. And, a lot of those instances of, the, the poor person becoming a billionaire is like very much like winning the lottery. It's not very realistic. And that brings me to another kind of point, which is the privilege required to actually be a writer. And this is something that makes a lot of writers uncomfortable. But for instance, me and you both know how a lot of these conferences work. They're not exactly cheap to go to. Most of them, they're not. And you have to travel there, which means you have to have both the money and the time, which means that you're not working, which means a lot of things, right? So writing is a necessarily expensive hobby, even if you're not spending money to write. And the industry itself, when we're talking about traditional publishing, is centered in New York City. And, New York City isn't necessarily representative of the amount of welfare that the rest of the world has. It's kind of a bubble. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on the writing industry at large, and what young writers stepping into it from different socioeconomic backgrounds might have to face, and then how we can kind of think about maybe making this industry a bit better, not trying to elude the problems, but trying to parse out what steps forward you think are necessary.
I think so. Actually, the the one thing I want to say, I think that we are of more use. Now, I may be wrong actually. So I'm going to say this, but I may backtrack actually. I wonder if we are more of use as readers than we are as writers, because as readers, we control the market. We control what stories are popular. I tell my young writers, my workshop attendees, my students, I tell them all the time, read different kinds of work. Like, don't just sit here and read the same white male authors or white female authors. Like, find different perspectives, find different things to read. Who are you picking up? Do you see a book with a name that you may not be able to pronounce? Do you put it back? Do you see a book with, a person whose, skin tone is different than yours? And do you just, say, hey, not for me? Those are the type of things that we have to start thinking about, at how we kind of have to retrain ourselves in shaping what the market can become. Because the books that are going to be chosen when you submit a book, the things that are going to be picked up by editors, by publishers, are the things that they know are going to sell. They're not going to take something that is risky, because it's not going to make money. It makes sense. That's the system. But we can control that to a degree, right? We can say, hey, these are the books that are becoming popular. These are the books we want to hear from. These are the writers we want more work from. I think that's really how we control a lot of the market. Now, in regard to writers facing specific struggles within the industry, I think on the flip side, I think it's just, you're gonna face a market that isn't always what you want it to be. And look, like, at the end of the day, write a good book and be proud of it. Write a good poetry collection and be proud of it. Like, just do that. The market may not be what actually works for you and your perspective, but let me tell you, the young writers that I know that are now here in the world, they freaking get stuff done and they are changing the market. So I'm very hopeful to see the type of works that are going to more frequently, be out there for Gen Z readers, and what Gen Z writers are going to incorporate in their own work. Yeah, so I think that's something that we can think about, and that's as simple as, next time you go to the bookstore, what are you picking up? What are you reading? Something really easy to just pick up a book you haven't read before from a name you don't know, or Google. There are so many phenomenal, but you could find a whole list. Go to like Oprah Magazine has a whole list of all books by Black authors. Phenomenal. They're beautiful books, like 100%. And I'm very happy to have like the experience in the schooling that I had, where there was a little bit more flexibility, where I could say, hey, I want these books in my curriculum. So that's phenomenal. Not everybody has that privilege to be able to control what they're reading. But it's our responsibility at the end of the day to make sure these books are on our bookshelf. So
I agree completely. And I think that nowadays as well, there's been a sort of resurgence in the number of actual like physical indie bookstores. I think 600 opened up last year and another 300 are opening up
Wow.
this year across America, which is pretty incredible. And most that are opening up, 20 years ago, before the internet, and 30 years ago, before Barnes & Noble, you would go to a bookstore and you would expect to be able to, this is the only place you could buy books. So, you expected to kind of have a little bit of everything. But Barnes & Noble had so much square footage that kind of started to disrupt that model. And then Amazon's completely disrupted it because Amazon literally has every book. But that doesn't mean that indie bookstores don't serve a purpose. And I think really the last couple of years, people have started to figure it out about, wait, we're really creating like a place for a community to come together. And, there's all across the country now, bookstores that cater to specific communities, Black-owned bookstores. There was a bookstore that I read an article about that just opened up in Chinatown in New York that's focused on Asian American literature. And it just keeps going on. There's going to be more of this. And that's an opportunity if you want to open up a bookstore, I guess. And I shouldn't even say that, like, I guess, like in a dismissing way, like you should do it. But I also think an easier way to do it, because it might be intimidating to think about opening up a bookstore if you're like in high school. I don't know if your parents will allow you to do that. And that's also a whole economic thing too. I'm not too familiar with what it takes to open a bookstore, in all honesty. But I am familiar with what it takes to start an Instagram account online or to start a Facebook group, something like that. And you can bring like-minded readers together so that you don't have to be counting on an agent to develop, to notice the market. Because I think that although it's true that, New York thinks about the market, I don't think there ever is a market. There's only one person's conception of it. And that never really sums up the whole picture. And there already is a ton of people out there who don't feel represented in the fiction that they are reading. And if you are able to connect with them, or you're able to find other books that connect with them, that is something that's really incredible, and that I think is a superpower. And you should go out there, you should do it. And if you're listening to this, odds are you at least have some sort of device that connects to the internet. Therefore, it's probably something that you could consider doing.
You've been so awesome with the questions for this episode. I have a question for you to put us back on track with talking about like writing as a craft, and how do we write about different socioeconomic backgrounds. As our like advice to young writers, I have a question. How do you personally write about characters with different socioeconomic backgrounds? And then how do you go about writing backgrounds that are not equal to yours, or that you don't necessarily have experience with?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think for me, when I'm writing, I do really try and think about how a character's socioeconomic class plays into their experience with the world, because I think that it also affects things like our own self-worth in many moments. I know that if you're in high school, it feels intimidating to go over to the person's house who has a pool and maybe a boat and a game room, all these things that people can have. And then you invite them over to your house, and it's like, yeah, there's nothing really to do. Although that's not true, but you feel like it. You feel like there's nothing to do. You feel like you have nothing to offer the world. And I think that I don't shy away from the fact that I write best from my experiences. So I try and relate to these feelings that I've felt before and write them. So I think I relate to a feeling like I just stated. But I also don't think any of us, since class is very fluid, I think we've all felt rich in moments and all felt poor in others. Even though like broadly society has like these metrics and, oh, okay, this costs that much. You put yourself in a different room and automatically it's like, well, I have quote unquote more than the people around me. And then you go into another room and it's like, wow, they are loaded, right? And I think since I've felt that before in my life, both sides of the coin, I've been able to translate that into my fiction. I do think about tropes when I write because I try and at least be aware of how other people often interface with this. And for me personally, I think that some of the tropes can be useful and some of them aren't. And instead of saying, oh, I don't ever want to write any tropes, I more think about what tropes do I actually like and do I connect with as a reader, and what tropes do I not. And I really try and write my books for like people who feel like underdogs, like my sayings, like everyday heroes that turn dark futures into light. So I'm not trying to necessarily connect with the rich kid and the struggles of being rich. I'm maybe trying to connect with another struggle that they've had in which they felt disadvantaged in their life. I'm not trying to write for everyone. And I know that sounds weird, but I'm actively trying to write for this audience that I imagine this community being. And it's not anything that matches like a specific group of like 18 to 24-year-old, this skin color, this state that they're from. No. But the ethos of, we have been on the down and out sometimes, and we're gonna try and make our lives better. And I that's kind of like always what it imbued there. But I don't try and make then in that simplistic version, oh, well, then the rich people are the enemies. I think that is something I personally try and avoid. And I would always try and avoid making any specific group the enemy, because I think that is the opposite of being inclusive. You might be writing with a specific person in mind, but you shouldn't be writing trying to make other people feel bad. That's never the idea. Some people you're going to connect with more, some people less. And for me, I've always tried to make the enemy in my books this deeper exploration of human nature that we all have inside of us, that kind of takes out any specific group, or, oh, it's the elites, or, oh, it's always the rich kid's fault. Like, that for me is never helpful. I don't like that. And I think that's really dangerous. So pick who you want your hero to be. Your hero, might speak more to certain people than others, because your hero can't be everyone's hero. But I would not make your enemy then someone that someone thinks like, oh God, am I the enemy? Because I think that's a recipe for creating more division in this world.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's something important. Like, your enemy in the book shouldn't be like specific qualities or like aspects. Like, it should be, I don't know, like, if I do write antagonists, they have like personality, like conflict with it. Like, it's either that they have some kind of hurt that they're carrying, that they are now getting in the way of now the protagonist's growth or whatever it is. So I agree with that, like making sure to, it's never always just this one thing that makes a villain. Yeah, I think for my advice on this, I'm definitely going to echo a lot of what you said. um I I agree with that system of, actually, let me not echo. Let me give some new thoughts. I think one thing, like, I agree with, let's think about what tropes are like fun for you to read as a reader, and then using that in your own writing. But I think also when writing about any kind of group, right? Talking to people, asking people of that group if you don't have experience. If I wanted to write about, growing up in, I don't know, somewhere random like South Florida, and like, what does like I
Yeah.
say South Florida because that's where my mom's from, but what does living the lower class life look there? That's something even just I'm
Mm.
unfamiliar with. Even though maybe the class I'm writing about is the same, because but I grew up in the North Carolina, so it would be different. So I think even something as simple as that, making sure that you're doing the research, because it's going to look very different from your experience probably, or at least aspects of it will. So talk to people who have that background, who live in that area. Who do they know? What do they do in their spare time? What was that life like? I think that it is really important to have such a thorough understanding of a socioeconomic background if you're going to write about it, especially if you're choosing to write about it for your protagonist. I always write about experiences like my own. So I don't think I would choose to write about like the super rich kid as my protagonist. That's just because it's not based on my experience, so it's harder for me to write about. But if that's something you want to do, make sure that you talk to people about that, and their struggles, and what their life looks like. So just do the research, know what you're writing about. I think that's my advice.
I agree wholeheartedly. And I think that's a really good way to cap us off with us ending off with some advice here. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And we're going to be talking many more episodes about being more inclusive in our writing and how we can really like build a community of readers, all these things. There's so much topics that kind of connect to this. We could also even do trope reviews, all these things. So it would be great to know in the comments what all of these ideas, what excites you the most, because we can record those sooner than later.
Yes. Thank you all for watching. We will see you next time. Peace out.
Yes, and do we want to do any plugs for the Young Eager Writer?
Follow us on Instagram, Young Eager Writers. That's my only plug for today, I think. I mean, do everything. Like, join our writing group, go to our workshops, do everything, but definitely follow the Instagram, because I've been doing a lot of Instagram posts recently. So hopefully by the time this episode comes out, it is just like flawless. But yeah, definitely follow us at Young Eager Writers. I will see you there.
Peace.
Bye.